Okay, here we go. Logical fallacies or problems with arguments. Of course, an argument is a presentation of reasons for a particular purpose or claim. It is composed of premises. Premises are statements that express your reason or evidence. These premises must be arranged in an appropriate way in order to support your conclusion. To craft a strong argument, you must possess a certain degree of familiarity with the subject, which comes from research, use good premises, find good support for your conclusions, focus only on the most relevant part of the issue, don't get sidetracked by rabbit trails, only make claims that are capable of being supported. This means avoiding sweeping claims, as those are rarely supportable. What is a fallacy? When an argument fails in one of the previously mentioned ways, that failing is called a fallacy. Essentially, fallacies are defects in an argument. They are very, very common and can be quite convincing. Most of us likely have been convinced by a fallacious argument before. In fact, we've likely presented one. Here are some types of fallacies. There are many, many. Far too many for us to look at them all in this presentation. We'll look at 16 of the more common fallacies. Starting with the hasty generalization. Making assumptions about an entire group of people or a range of cases based on an inadequately small sample, which creates a general rule based on a single case, and stereotypes are a common example. For example, my roommate from Maine loves lobster ravioli. Therefore, all people from Maine must love lobster ravioli. Yeah, that's not good. Next, missing the point. The premise supports a conclusion other than the one it is meant to support. For example, there has been an increase in burglary in the area. More people are moving into the area. Therefore, the burglary is directly caused by the increased number of people moving into the area. Yeah, that's not good either. Post hoc or false cause. Post hoc comes from the Latin phrase post hoc ergo propter hoc, which when translated is after this, because of this. This fallacy assumes that because X precedes Y, therefore X caused Y. You may have heard it explained as correlation is not the same as causation. Superstitious beliefs are due to the post hoc fallacy. An athlete wears their lucky socks and wins the game. This is a common fallacy found in news articles, especially those pertaining to some scientific or medical study. For example, cell phone usage has increased exponentially in the last 20 years. Researchers discovered that the incidences of brain cancer have also increased in that time. Therefore, cell phone usage must cause brain cancer. Yeah, that's not true. All right, the slippery slope. Falsely assuming that one thing will inevitably lead to another and another and another until we have reached some unavoidable dire consequence. It does not allow for the idea that one can stop at any point on the slope. It does not necessarily have to lead to the inevitable dire consequence. Restraint is possible. For example, if you buy a Green Day album, then you will buy the Avengers. Before you know it, you'll be a punk with green hair and tats. If you don't want to have green hair, then you can't buy a Green Day album. That's true. Weak analogy is number 5. Many arguments rely on an analogy between two or more objects, ideas, or situations. However, drawing an analogy alone is not enough to prove anything. It is crucial to make sure that the two things being compared are truly alike in the relevant areas. Life is like a box of chocolates. You never know what you're going to get. How similar are life and a box of chocolates? Yeah, how similar are they? Appeal to authority, number 6. This does not refer to appropriately citing an expert, but rather when an arguer tries to get people to agree with him or her by appealing to a supposed authority who isn't much of an expert. For example, gun laws should be extremely strict, and it should be incredibly difficult to acquire a gun. Many respected people, such as actor Brad Pitt, have expressed their support of this movement. Brad Pitt has nothing to do with this. He's not an expert. Appeal to pity. Attempting to convince an individual to accept a conclusion by making them feel sorry for someone. For example, I know the paper was due today, but my computer died last week, and then the computer lab was too noisy. So while I was on my way to the library, a cop pulled me over and wrote me a ticket, and I was so upset by the ticket that I sat by the side of the road crying for 3 hours. You should give me an A for all the trouble I've been through. These fallacies are quite common around the due date of the final paper. Appeal to ignorance. Essentially, this fallacy states that because there is no conclusive evidence, we should therefore accept the arguer's conclusion on the subject. The arguer attempts to use the lack of evidence as support for a positive claim about the truth of a conclusion. The exception to this fallacy is the case of qualified scientific research. For example, not a single report of a flying saucer has ever been authenticated. Therefore, flying saucers don't exist. Ad populum, the bandwagon fallacy. Also referred to as the bandwagon fallacy, the arguer tries to convince the audience to do or believe something because everyone else supposedly does. For example, an increasing number of people are turning to yoga as a way to get in touch with their inner being. Therefore, yoga helps one get in touch with their inner being. Yeah, that's absolutely awful. Ad hominem, attacking the opponent instead of the opponent's argument. Example, Allison Smith is a bad mother whose idea of parenting is leaving her children with a nanny. Therefore, we shouldn't listen to her ideas on improvements in the college classroom. That is so not good. Tu quoque. In this fallacy, the arguer points out that the opponent has actually done the thing he or she is arguing against and concluding that we do not have to listen to the argument. Mother, smoking is bad for your health and expensive. I hope to never see you do it. Daughter, but you did it when you were my age, therefore I can do it too. That was the mother screaming. Straw man. The arguer sets up a weaker version of the opponent's position and seeks to prove the watered-down version rather than the position the opponent actually holds. Through this misrepresentation, the arguer concludes that the real position has been refuted. For example, those who seek to abolish the death penalty are seeking to allow murderers and others who commit heinous crimes to simply get off scot-free with no consequence for their actions. Red herring. This is number 13. The arguer goes off on a tangent midway through the argument, raising a side issue that distracts the audience from the actual argument. For example, we admit that this measure is unpopular, but we also urge you to note that there are so many issues on this ballot that the whole thing is getting ridiculous. Yeah, that's a red herring. Number 14, false dichotomy. In this fallacy, the arguer sets up the situation so that it looks as though there are only two choices. When the arguer then eliminates one of the choices, it appears that there's only one option left, the arguer's assertion. There are rarely only two choices. If we were to think about them at all, it may not appear to be as clear a choice. In other words, I can't find my book. It was either stolen or I never had it. I know I had it. Therefore, it must have been stolen. Begging the question. And you often hear this phrase, that begs the question. The arguer asks the audience to simply accept the conclusion without providing any real evidence, either through the use of circular reasoning or by simply ignoring an important but questionable assumption that the argument rests on. Circular reasoning occurs when the premise states the same thing as the conclusion. Harder to detect than many other fallacies, this one is. Here's an example. Adam, God must exist. Josh, how do you know? Adam, because the Bible says so. Josh, why should I believe the Bible? Adam, because the Bible was written by God. Example 2. If such actions were not illegal, then they would not be prohibited by the law. Equivocation. Equivocation means to slide between two or more different meanings of a word or phrase that is critical to the argument. For an argument to work, the words must have the same meaning throughout the premise and the conclusion. For example, the church would like to encourage theism. Theism is a medical condition resulting from the excessive consumption of tea. Therefore, the church ought to freely distribute tea. How to prevent fallacies. First of all, pretend to argue against yourself. Take the other side. List the evidence for each of your main points and investigate your own personal fallacies. Give the appropriate amount of proofs for your claim. Remember, broad claims need more proof than narrow claims. And above all, fairly characterize the arguments of others. And that, my friends, is how you avoid fallacies.